She had only been employed at the remote forward operating base for 3 weeks. To the naval special warfare personnel who trained there daily, she was practically invisible, just another local contractor hired to perform the mundane but essential task of keeping the facility operational. Her name was Amira, a young woman from a nearby village who had lied about her age to get the job, claiming she was 22 when she had only just turned 19. The money was necessary for her family. Her father was ill, and her younger brothers needed school fees. The American base, with its high walls and constant hum of generators, was a world away from the dusty streets she grew up on, yet it had quickly become her sanctuary. And her task each morning was simple: tidy the indoor firing range before the SEAL team arrived for their daily close-quarters drills. This meant sweeping the rubber bullet casings from the floor, wiping down the concrete partitions, and restocking the cardboard target stands. It was monotonous work, but Amira found a strange peace in it. The smell of gun oil and cordite no longer made her flinch as it had on her first day. The sharp, controlled bursts of gunfire she heard echoing from the outdoor ranges had become the rhythm of her new life. She liked the Americans. They were loud and often crude, but they treated her with a distant professional respect. They paid her fairly, and the chubby logistics officer always made sure she had a cold bottle of water at midday. This particular morning started like any other, and the sun was just beginning to climb over the jagged brown mountains to the east, painting the sky in pale oranges and yellows. Amira pushed her cart, laden with cleaning supplies and a fresh stack of targets, through the heavy metal door of the main firing range building. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint coppery scent of spent ammunition. She began her ritual, sweeping the fine dust and debris from the concrete floor, her mind drifting to the pot of stew she would make for her family that evening. The range was silent, the thick soundproofed walls muting the outside world completely. She was alone with her thoughts and the soft shush-shush of her broom. Then, the world ended. It didn't start with a bang, but with a deep percussive crump that she felt in her chest rather than heard. The concrete floor vibrated violently, sending her cleaning cart clattering to its side. For a second, Amira froze, her broom held aloft. She thought it was an accident, a misfire from the demolitions pit a mile away. But then the crump was followed by the frantic, throaty chatter of heavy machine guns, a sound utterly distinct from the disciplined fire she was used to. This was wild, angry, and terrifyingly close. The lights flickered and died, plunging the long tunnel of the firing range into near-total darkness, save for the thin sliver of light creeping under the thick blast door at the entrance she had used just minutes before. Another explosion, closer this time, shook the building. Dust rained from the ceiling joints. Amira stumbled back, dropping the broom. See, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them. This was not an accident. This was an attack. She shrank into the corner behind the heavy concrete partition used as a shooting stall, pulling her thin cotton hijab over her mouth to filter the dust. The sounds, filtering through the reinforced walls, were horrific. The constant thud of explosions, the snapping, tearing sound of small arms fire, and above it all, the desperate shouted commands in English. The voices were getting closer. They were falling back. Inside the pitch-black range, Amira had no concept of time. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour. She just knelt there, trembling, reciting prayers under her breath that she hadn't spoken since she was a child. The gunfire outside became a chaotic symphony, surging and ebbing. Then a new sound. A loud, metallic crash against the heavy blast door, the only door, followed by the frantic beeping of an electronic keypad. Someone was trying to get in. Whoever it was, they were punching in the entry code wrong, making the keypad emit angry, negative tones. A muffled, frantic voice seeped through the steel. Come on, open, damn it! It was a man's voice, strained with panic and exertion. Finally, a positive beep, and the heavy hydraulic mechanism groaned. The blast door swung inward and a figure stumbled through, backlit by the flashing orange and white of explosions outside. He was a massive silhouette, a giant hunched over under the weight of combat gear. He turned and immediately put his shoulder to the door, heaving it closed. In the flash of light from outside before the door sealed, Amira saw him clearly for a split second. It was one of the SEALs, the tall one with the sad eyes they called the Chief. His face was smeared with dirt and sweat, his eyes wide with a focus she had never seen before. He was alone. The door boomed shut, plunging them into absolute darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of his ragged, heavy breathing and the distant, muffled thuds of the battle still raging outside. He was leaning against the door, his back to it, trying to catch his breath. Then, his voice cut through the dark, a harsh whisper. "Who's in here? Sound off!" Amira tried to speak, but her voice was a strangled whisper. She cleared her throat, fear gripping her. "It is me, the cleaner. Amira," she managed, her accent thick with terror. She heard him shift, the rustle of his gear loud in the silence. "Amira, Jesus. Get down. Get down on the floor and stay against the wall." She didn't need to be told twice. She pressed herself harder into the corner. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice cracking. He didn't answer her directly. She heard him moving, feeling his way along the wall. Then a click, and a small, powerful flashlight on his tactical vest cut through the dark. The beam swept over her, making her wince, then moved on, scanning the long, empty range. He was checking for threats, a habit so ingrained it was automatic even in a place he knew was empty. "Haji ambush," he finally grunted, his voice tight. "They breached the perimeter. We got split up. My squad is pinned down on the other side of the QRF compound." He was talking more to himself than to her. He moved to a low concrete bench and sat down heavily, his back against the wall. And in the thin beam of the angled flashlight, Amira could see him better. He was a mess. His tan combat shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was a dark, glistening patch on his thigh that she realized with a jolt was blood. He had been hit. He saw her staring at the wound. "It's a scratch. Through and through. Didn't hit the artery." He said it flatly, without emotion, but his face was pale under the grime. He looked at his rifle, a bulky M4 with numerous attachments. He checked the magazine, slapped it back in. He then looked at the heavy blast door, his only barrier against the enemy. It was thick, but it wouldn't hold forever against a determined force with explosives. His eyes, when they fell on Amira again, were filled with a chilling calculation. He was a warrior, trained to fight, and she was a civilian, a liability. Now she could see him trying to figure out his next move. He was trapped, wounded, and now responsible for a terrified girl who didn't know which end of a gun to hold. The weight of it seemed to press down on him, pushing him deeper into the concrete wall. He was a protector, but right now he felt like a caged animal. The sudden, sharp crack of gunfire, much closer this time, made them both flinch. It wasn't outside the blast door. It was from the ventilation shaft high up on the wall. The enemy was in the compound, and they were clearing buildings. They were searching. Amira looked at the SEAL, and for the first time, she saw something other than strength in his eyes. She saw the flicker of a terrible decision being made. He couldn't fight a firefight and protect her at the same time. He was looking at his rifle, then at her, and she knew, as with a sickening clarity, what was going through his mind. He was going to have to make her a part of the fight. He moved with a suddenness that made her gasp, crossing the space between them in 2 silent strides. He crouched in front of her, his wounded leg protesting with a wince he couldn't quite hide. He unslung his rifle, the primary tool of his trade, his lifeline. He held it out to her, the heavy black weapon hanging in the air between them. In the dim light, his face was a mask of grim resolve. "You know how to use one of these?" he whispered, his voice low and urgent. Amira stared at the weapon as if it were a poisonous snake. It was heavier than anything she had ever held. She shook her head, mute with terror. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look disappointed. He just looked tired. "It's okay," he lied. Then he placed the rifle on the ground next to her, within her reach. He then reached to his hip and unholstered his sidearm, a bulky MK-25 pistol. He checked the chamber, made sure a round was ready, and flicked off the safety. He held that out to her instead. "This is easier," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Point and pull the trigger. It's going to be loud. It's going to jump in your hand. Don't drop it." He pressed the cool, heavy grip of the pistol into her unwilling palm. Her hand was shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. He closed his own large, rough hand over hers, steadying it. He looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time he spoke to her not as a soldier to a civilian, but as one human being to another. "I have to go to the door. I have to hold them as long as I can. If I go down, if they get past me—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. "You stay in this corner. You stay quiet. And if one of them comes through that door and I'm not there to stop him, you shoot him. You don't think, you don't hesitate. You point it at his chest, and you pull the trigger until it clicks empty. Do you understand?" Tears were streaming down Amira's face, cutting clean tracks through the dust. She looked at the pistol in her hands, a tool of death, then at the man in front of her, a stranger who was asking her to become a killer to save her own life. She nodded, a tiny jerky movement. "I understand," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He gave her hand one last squeeze and let go. He then picked up his rifle from the floor and moved silently back towards the blast door, taking up a position behind a thick steel support pillar. He leaned his head against the cool metal for a second, closing his eyes. He was leaving a scared girl in a corner with a handgun, putting the fate of her life into her own hands. It was against every rule, every instinct. But rules and instincts were for a world that made sense. This was chaos. And in chaos, you used whatever tool you had. Right now, Amira was the only backup he had. The silence that followed was suffocating. Amira sat in the dark, the pistol an impossible weight in her lap. She could just make out the silhouette of the seal, motionless behind his pillar, waiting. Outside, the muffled sounds of the assault continued, but they seemed more distant now, more focused on other parts of the base. She prayed they would stay away, that the thick door would hold, and that the nightmare would end. But deep down, in the primal part of her brain that was now screaming for survival, she knew it wouldn't. She knew, with the certainty of a coming storm, that they would come. And when they did, she would have to be ready to use the weapon in her hands. She was no longer just the cleaner, she was the last line of defense. She tightened her grip on the pistol, feeling the aggressive texture of the grip bite into her sweaty palm, and waited for the door to open. The first indication that their sanctuary had been compromised wasn't a sound at the heavy blast door, but a shift in the air. A faint current, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and burnt propellant, whispered from the direction of the back of the range. Amira's eyes, now fully adjusted to the dark, widened in horror. There, and at the far end of the 100-meter lane, a rectangle of flickering orange light appeared. It was a small ventilation door, its corroded hinges finally giving way to the force of a crowbar from the outside. The enemy hadn't bothered with the front door. They had found a back entrance. The seal saw it too. She heard his sharp intake of breath from his position near the main entrance. He was caught in a lethal trap. If he stayed by the front door, the enemy would enter from behind and cut them down. If he moved to engage the new threat, he would have to cross the open range, leaving the front door unguarded. He was one man, wounded, with a terrified girl and a pistol as his only reinforcements. He moved. It was the only choice he had. He pushed off from the pillar and began a low, silent sprint down the length of the firing range, keeping low behind the concrete partitions that divided the lanes. He moved like a ghost, his boots making no sound on the rubberized floor. Amira watched him go, her heart in her throat. She was alone now, truly alone, with the front door to her right and the enemy entering from the far left. The orange light from the ventilation shaft grew brighter, and then a shadow blocked it. A figure dropped down, landing silently on the range floor. Then another. They were speaking in low, guttural whispers. Their weapons, a K-pattern rifles she could see now, swinging left and right, scanning the darkness. They hadn't seen the seal yet. They were advancing slowly, clearing as they came. The seal was crouched behind a partition 50 meters from them, waiting. He was letting them come, letting them walk into his kill zone. Amira could see his plan. He would wait until they were close, until he could guarantee taking them both out before they could return fire. It was a good plan, a textbook ambush. But the enemy didn't follow the textbook. One of them, the second one through the vent, wasn't focused on the range in front of him. His eyes were scanning the walls, the ceiling, and then his gaze stopped. He was looking at the small red glow of the emergency exit sign above the main blast door, and in the faint reflected light of that sign, he saw her. He saw Amira, huddled in her corner, the pistol glinting dully in her lap. He shouted a warning to his companion and raised his rifle. Time didn't slow down for Amira. It didn't become a series of snapshots. It simply stopped. She was looking down the black hole of an AK-47's barrel, and she knew, and with absolute certainty, that she was about to die. The noise of the rifle blast would be the last thing she ever heard. But the blast never came from his gun. It came from her left. The seal, seeing his ambush compromised, had no choice but to fire early. His M4 erupted, a controlled 3-round burst that caught the first fighter square in the chest, dropping him instantly. The second fighter, the one aiming at Amira, spun towards the new threat, his rifle spitting fire. The range erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness, casting grotesque, jumping shadows on the walls. Amira was frozen, her hands clamped over her ears, the pistol forgotten in her lap. She watched the seal and the remaining fighter exchange fire. The seal was firing from behind cover, his shots precise and measured. And the fighter was firing wildly, spraying bullets that ricocheted off the concrete with angry whines. Then the seal grunted and stumbled back, hit again. He went down on one knee, his rifle clattering to the floor. The fighter, seeing his chance, let out a triumphant yell and stepped out from behind his own cover, raising his rifle for the killing shot. He was standing in the open, 20 meters from Amira, his back partially turned to her. All his attention was on the wounded seal. He didn't see her. He didn't know she was there. The seal looked up from the floor, his face contorted in pain and fury. He wasn't looking at the fighter advancing on him. He was looking past him. He was looking directly at Amira. His eyes found hers in the darkness, and in them she saw no plea, no command. She just saw a simple, stark question. Now? The fighter took another step towards the seal, his finger tightening on the trigger. Amira's hand moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was as if her arm had a will of its own, a will to live that bypassed her paralyzed brain. Her fingers closed around the grip of the pistol, the same way the seal had shown her. She raised it, the weight immense, her arms trembling. She pointed it at the man's back, just as she had been told, at his chest, at his center mass. She pulled the trigger. The sound was an apocalyptic hammer blow against her eardrums, far louder than she ever imagined. The gun bucked in her hand, just as the seal had warned, the slide ripping back and ejecting a smoking casing that bounced off her cheek, burning her skin. She almost dropped it, but she held on. She had her eyes squeezed shut, but she forced them open. The man was still standing. He was turning, a look of stunned surprise on his face. She pulled the trigger again, and again, and again. She didn't count. She didn't aim. She just pointed and pulled the trigger until the slide locked back on an empty magazine, and the only sound was the dull click of the firing pin striking an empty chamber. The fighter stood for a long, impossible second. Then his rifle slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly on the concrete. He crumpled to his knees, and then pitched forward onto his face, lying still. The silence that returned was deafening. It was filled only by the high-pitched whine in Amira's ears and the ragged, wet sound of the seal's breathing. She sat there, the empty pistol still held out in front of her, her arms rigid, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. And she stared at the body on the floor, a dark, crumpled heap in the faint orange glow from the open vent. She had killed a man. She had ended a life. The reality of it was too vast, too terrible to comprehend. She didn't hear the seal get up. She didn't see him limp towards her. She only felt his presence when he knelt beside her and gently, so gently, took the empty pistol from her rigid fingers. He set it aside. Then he took her hand, the one that had just fired the shots, and held it. His hand was warm, and it was shaking too. "You did good," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You did so good. You saved my life." Amira looked at him, then back at the body. A sob escaped her, a raw, animal sound of grief and terror. She had come to work to sweep a floor. She was only tidying up the firing range. And now, she was a killer. And the seal didn't try to shush her. He just kept holding her hand, his own lifeblood seeping from his wounds onto the floor beside her. They sat like that, two broken people in the dark, waiting for rescue or death, whichever came first. The battle still raged outside, but in this small pocket of the world, there was only silence and the heavy weight of what had just been done. They waited in the suffocating dark for what felt like an eternity. The seal, whose name she learned was Ryan, had used his radio to send out a frantic, whispered distress call. The enemy was inside the wire, and two friendlies were pinned in the kill house. The response was a terse, professional acknowledgement. "Hold what you have. QRF is inbound. ETA 5 mics. 5 minutes. It might as well have been 5 hours. Ryan had dragged himself back towards the main blast door, leaving a smear of blood on the concrete to reestablish his defensive position. He couldn't rely on Amira to fight again. He could see she was deep in shock, her eyes vacant, her body trembling in the corner. He had retrieved his rifle and now lay prone behind the steel pillar, his good eye trained on the main entrance, his wounded leg throbbing with a fire that threatened to consume him. The ventilation shaft at the back was a gaping wound in their defenses. But he had to trust that the enemy would be stupid enough to use the front door again. If they came from both ends now, they were dead. Amira sat where he had left her, the empty pistol gone, replaced by a cold that seeped into her bones. She stared at the body of the man she had killed. In the dim light, she could make out the edge of his shirt, the worn sole of his boot. He was someone. He had a mother, maybe a wife, children who would never understand why he didn't come home. She had taken that from them. The enormity of it pressed down on her, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. She thought of her own father, her brothers. She had done this to save herself, to save the man who had trusted her with his weapon. But the justification felt thin, a fragile shield against the onslaught of guilt. The sound of boots on gravel outside the main door snapped her back to the present. It wasn't the heavy, cautious tread of a squad moving into danger. It was the confident, hurried run of men who thought the hard part was over. Ryan heard it, too. He tensed, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The electronic keypad beeped, and this time with a positive, authorized code. A voice, muffled but distinctly American, came through the steel. "Romeo 7? This is Medevac. We're coming in. Don't shoot." Ryan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Clear. We're clear. Doors open." The heavy door swung inward, and suddenly the range was flooded with the harsh white light of tactical flashlights. 4 figures in American combat gear swept in, their weapons up, scanning, clearing. Behind them came 2 more, dragging a collapsible stretcher. The lead medic went straight to Ryan, kneeling beside him, already cutting away his pant leg to assess the wound. "Chief, you look like shit," the medic said, his voice a study in calm professionalism. "Been better, Doc," Ryan grunted, wincing as the medic probed the wound. "The girl! Check the girl!" "Ah, she's in the corner." A corpsman broke away and approached Amira. She flinched as the light hit her face, throwing up a hand to shield her eyes. Hey, it's okay," the young man said softly, crouching in front of her. "You're safe now. We're the good guys. Are you hurt? Are you hit anywhere?" Amira could only shake her head, mute. She wasn't hurt. Not in any way a bandage could fix. The corpsman looked her over quickly, professionally, checking for physical wounds. He saw no blood, no obvious trauma. But his eyes, when they met hers, held a deep, quiet understanding. He had seen this look before. He knew the wounds she carried were invisible. As the medics worked on Ryan, preparing him for transport, one of the other SEALs, a big man with a close-cropped beard and a voice like gravel, surveyed the scene. When he saw the 2 enemy bodies, the spent brass casings everywhere, and the blood trail leading from Ryan's position at the door to his current location. He walked over to the body near Amira's corner, the one with multiple pistol wounds in his back. He looked at the body, then at Amira, then back at Ryan. "Chief," he asked, his voice low, "what happened here? This one?" He gestured to the body near Amira. "This isn't your work. Your rounds are 5.56. This is 9 miles. He held up a spent casing he'd picked up from the floor near Amira. "Who fired these?" Ryan, now being lifted onto the stretcher, met his teammate's gaze. There was a long, heavy pause. The only sounds were the distant pops of sporadic gunfire still echoing across the base and the quiet hiss of the medical equipment. Ryan looked past his teammate, past the medics, and found Amira's eyes in the darkness. She was watching him, her face a mask of fear and exhaustion. He could lie. He could say he'd fired the shots, that he'd used his sidearm in the chaos. It would be the easy thing to do. It would protect her from the endless questions, the investigations, the label that would follow her for the rest of her life. But it would be a lie. And she deserved better than a lie. He looked back at his teammate. "She did," he said, his voice clear and strong despite his pain. He nodded towards Amira. "Her name is Amira. She works here. She's the cleaner. When I got hit the second time, that guy," he pointed at the body, "had me dead to rights. He was 2 seconds from putting a round in my head. She picked up my sidearm, and she dropped him. She saved my life." A profound silence fell over the range. Then every operator, every medic, stopped what they were doing and looked at the small, trembling young woman in the corner. The big seal with the gravel voice stared at her, then at the body, then back at her. He walked over to her, his heavy boots loud on the concrete. He loomed over her, a giant of a man, and for a terrifying second, Amira thought he was going to hurt her. Instead, he knelt, bringing himself to her eye level. "That true?" he asked, his voice softer now. "You did this?" Amira looked at the body one last time, then back at the man. She didn't nod. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, her eyes filled with a 1,000-yard stare that no 19-year-old should ever possess. It was answer enough. The big man reached out, and with a surprising gentleness, placed a massive hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said, simply. "You saved one of my brothers. I am in your debt." The moment was broken by the urgent need to move. The base was still not secure. Ryan was loaded onto the stretcher, his face pale from blood loss. As they carried him past Amira, he reached out a weak hand and grabbed hers. His grip was feeble, but his eyes were fierce. "Amira," he whispered, "you're not a killer. You're a survivor. Don't you ever forget that. You hear me? You're a survivor." And then he was gone, carried out into the smoke-filled night, leaving Amira alone with the corpsman and the bodies. The corpsman helped her to her feet. Her legs were so weak she could barely stand. He wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders, the kind of crinkly silver material she had only ever seen in movies. He led her out of the range, and away from the smell of blood and cordite, and into the chaos of the base. The world outside was a nightmare. Fires burned in the distance, casting an eerie glow. Men ran everywhere, shouting. Helicopters thundered overhead, their searchlights sweeping the perimeter. The corpsman guided her to a bunker, a reinforced concrete shelter already crowded with other base personnel, all wearing the same dazed, terrified expression. He sat her down, handed her a bottle of water, and told her to stay put. Someone would come for her soon. Amira sat in the bunker, the silver blanket pulled tight around her, and listened to the sounds of the battle finally, blessedly, begin to fade. The gunfire grew sporadic, then stopped altogether. The explosions ceased, and the only sound left was the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors and the occasional shouted command. The attack was over. They had survived. But as she sat there, surrounded by strangers, the weight of what she had done pressed down on her heavier than ever. She could still feel the pistol bucking in her hand. She could still see the man's face as he turned, the surprise in his eyes. She could still hear the deafening roar of the shots. She was a survivor, Ryan had said. But what did a survivor do when the surviving was over? How did she go back to sweeping floors, to making stew for her family, to being the girl she was just this morning? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the eastern mountains, illuminating a base scarred by battle and a girl forever changed by war. The days that followed the attack existed in a strange, hazy fog for Amira. The American base, once a place of predictable routine, became a hive of intense activity. Investigators from something called NCIS arrived, serious men and women in crisp uniforms, who asked her the same questions over and over again. They were polite, even kind, offering her sweetened tea and taking breaks when they saw her becoming too distressed. But they were relentless in their pursuit of facts. They had her walk them through the firing range, recreating her movements, her position, the angle of her shots. They took her cleaning cart, the broom, the pistol she had used. They treated her with a deference that felt alien, as if she were a visiting dignitary rather than a frightened contractor. Through it all, Ryan was gone. Medevaced to a hospital ship, and then to a larger military hospital in Germany, she was told. She asked about him constantly, but the answers were always vague. He's in stable condition. He's a tough son of a gun. He'll pull through. No one would tell her if he was okay, if the leg would heal, if he would ever walk properly again. The man who had held her hand in the dark, who had called her a survivor, had vanished from her life as suddenly as he had entered it. 2 weeks after the attack, she was summoned to the office of the base commanding officer, a stern-faced Navy captain with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She went in trembling, expecting to be fired, or worse, arrested for using a weapon she had no business touching. Instead, the captain stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that made her knees weak. He thanked her. Formally, officially, and on behalf of the United States Navy, he thanked her for her actions. He told her that her bravery had saved the life of one of their own, a decorated combat veteran, a husband, and a father. He handed her a folded American flag encased in a glass display box and a letter of commendation. She took them with hands that still shook, not knowing what to say. The other SEALs, the ones who remained on base, treated her differently now. They no longer looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. They nodded to her when she passed, some even offering a quiet ma'am or a respectful dip of the head. The big one with the gravel voice, whose name she learned was Senior Chief Martinez, made a point of seeking her out every few days, just to ask how she was doing, if she needed anything. He never mentioned the shooting, never pried. He just made sure she knew she wasn't alone. But she felt alone. The nightmares came every night. She would wake in a cold sweat, the sound of gunfire echoing in her ears, the image of the man's face as he fell burned into her mind. She stopped sleeping in her room, preferring to curl up on the floor of the small living area where her mother and brothers slept, finding a small measure of comfort in the sound of their breathing. Her mother noticed the change, the shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden noises. Amira told her nothing. How could she? How could she explain to her gentle, pious mother that her daughter had killed a man? The letter came 6 weeks after the attack. It was hand-delivered by Martinez, who wore an expression she couldn't quite read. He held out a thick, cream-colored envelope. "Sight, this came for you," he said. "Forwarded through the base. It's from him." He didn't need to say who him was. Amira took the envelope with trembling fingers. Her name was written on the front in a bold, slightly shaky scrawl. She waited until Martinez had left, until she was alone in the small storage room that served as her break area, before she opened it. Inside were several sheets of paper, covered in the same bold handwriting. It was a long letter, the kind you write when you have too much time to think and too much to say. Ryan wrote that he was recovering. The leg was messed up pretty bad, he said, but the docs thought he'd keep it. He was going to have a hell of a scar and a limp that would probably ache when it rained. But he was alive, and he owed that to her. He wrote about his family, and about his wife Sarah and his 2 little girls, ages 4 and 6. He included a photograph, a creased snapshot of a smiling woman with kind eyes and 2 giggling girls with pigtails, all of them squished together on a sofa. He said he looked at that photo every day, and every day he thanked God that he got to see them again. And he thanked her. He wrote about that night in the range. He said he replayed it in his head constantly, the terror of being trapped, the helplessness of being wounded, the moment he handed her the pistol. He said he had been scared, not for himself, but for her. He had been scared that he had condemned her to death by giving her that weapon, by making her a target. He wrote that he had never been so wrong about anything in his life. He said she was the bravest person he had ever met, and he had met a lot of brave people. The final pages were different. They weren't about the attack, or about gratitude, or about bravery. They were about guilt. He wrote about the men she had killed, for there had been two, the one she shot and the one he had killed first. He wrote that he understood the weight she was carrying. He understood the nightmares, the way the face of the enemy haunted you, the way you questioned every decision, every pull of the trigger. He wrote that he had been fighting for 15 years, and he still carried every single one of them with him. He said the guilt never fully went away, but it changed. It became a part of you, a scar on your soul. And like any scar, it was a reminder of what you had done, yes, but also a reminder that you had survived, that you had chosen to live. See Amira, he wrote in the last paragraph, the handwriting becoming even more uneven, as if he was struggling to find the right words. You asked me in the dark if you were a killer. I told you you were a survivor. I meant it. But I've had time to think. And I need to tell you something else. You're not just a survivor. You're a hero. Not because you killed a man, but because, in a moment of absolute terror, when every instinct told you to hide, to curl up, to pray for it to end, you chose to act. You chose to save another human being. That's not killing. That's the opposite of killing. That's love. That's the purest form of love there is, laying down your own safety, your own innocence, your own peace of mind, for someone else. You did that for me, a stranger. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you did. Please, Amira, please don't let the guilt destroy the beautiful, brave person you are. She read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, falling on the pages and smudging the ink. When she finished, she clutched the photograph of Ryan's family to her chest and wept. She wept for the man she had killed. She wept for the man she had saved. She wept for the girl she used to be, the girl who only had to worry about sweeping floors and making stew. And when the tears were finally spent, she felt something she hadn't felt since that night in the range. She felt a tiny, fragile flicker of peace. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in its envelope along with the photograph, and tucked it into the pocket of her uniform, over her heart. She had a long way to go. The nightmares would probably continue, and the guilt would likely never fully vanish. But for the first time, she thought she might be able to carry it. She might be able to bear the weight of what she had done, because she finally understood why she had done it. She had done it for love, for a stranger, for a man with sad eyes and a family who got to keep him because of her. And that, she realized, was something she could live with.